Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I feel like it's been a while since I last posted, apologies for that, busy times, but I wanted to do a video on future challenges for museum interpretation and heritage storytelling. We don't talk much about challenges, or if we do, it's sort of in connection with specific projects most of the time. I wanted to do a video where I don't bombard you with an awful lot of text. I know I have a tendency of doing that, but where I try to talk from some specific headlines, very different challenges where we might face potential risks or things that we just need to be aware of in the future of museum interpretation and storytelling. So you can skip between these as you like, jump to the one you find most interesting, and also of course please add your own, because it would be really interesting to hear if there are things, tendencies, trends you have identified that could pose potential risks or challenges in the future, and where we need to be aware as we go about developing interpretation and storytelling. So as always, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and please do add your comments below, because this is a subject I think we need to keep alive and keep discussing. So let's dive into it. Let's begin with the most obvious one: digital transformation. When we explore advancements in technology, anything from virtual reality, augmented reality, AI, interactive apps, you name it, we are reshaping the way visitors experience and engage with our exhibitions, and it influences so many things, and there are a number of challenges involved in this, and we are already dealing with a lot of them, from everything from technological integration, how we incorporate new technologies into museum environments, that can be very complex. Access and inclusion challenges. Digital tools can sometimes create barriers for certain visitor groups. Those with limited technological abilities and so on. And that can be a bit of a challenge. There are costs and resources in everything from development and maintaining the digital exhibitions. Anything with regards to hardware, software, content creation, and so on and so on. It also impacts our visitor engagement. Digital elements can enhance engagement, but they can also distract from core storytelling elements sometimes, and from artifacts. Technological issues, we all know about those. There's a lot of maintenance involved, and the moment a digital feature or a technological feature doesn't work anymore, it needs to be fixed and repaired immediately. There are different visitor learning styles we need to take into consideration. There are sustainability concerns or issues around digital technology. And then, of course, long-term relevance challenges, because digital technology evolves so rapidly, and what was modern today is so outdated tomorrow. And it's so hard to keep up with everything and make sure you have the most relevant feature available. It also requires training and education for your staff, for volunteers as well, in using these tools and in being on top of them, especially when it comes to integrating them in your interpretation. When we talk about personalisation and customisation in context of museum interpretation and heritage storytelling, it offers some exciting possibilities, especially for tailoring experiences to individual visitors. And of course, there are a lot of challenges around these considerations as well. Everything from privacy concerns to ethical dilemmas. Also, assumptions of preferences. I think especially when we talk about audience segments or visitor groups, target audiences, We tend to assume a lot of things based on surveys or algorithms of visitor preferences and so on, and it might not always be what visitors actually want or what they're looking for. There are also elements around cultural sensitivity that we need to take into consideration when it comes to making something personal or customizing something. I talk about overwhelm and museum fatigue in a different video, but that's certainly something we need to take into consideration as well for the individual. Authenticity requirements. There might be elements where we actually dilute the authenticity of a narrative or an object or a collection if we try to make it too personal or try to customize it too much to the individual. So finding that balance is essential. Accessibility is a huge one as well for visitors with various physical disabilities as well as mental disabilities. The infrastructure with which we set up our museum exhibitions, and also when we challenge visitors' preferences or assumptions, because sometimes visitors do come with certain personalized assumptions that might be wrong sometimes. But there's also a huge element in building trust with visitors. And that's really where I wanted to go with this particular challenge of personalization, because we want to build trust to our visitors. And everything we do is more or less based on that trust. The entire museum visit, inviting someone in to our spaces, to learn, to experience, to explore, and so on, is a relationship based on trust. And I think sometimes maybe we need to just remind ourselves of that. Ethical storytelling in museums and heritage sites is such an interesting one, and oh my, does it present a lot of challenges. But there's also so many great things to include when we talk about ethical considerations. Key aspects, of course, is assuring historical accuracy, finding that balance for engaging narratives with historical accuracy. I talk about that in a different video as well, but it can be really, really challenging. When it comes to underrepresented voices, this is an amazing opportunity of focusing in on minority groups. It can also be controversial topics that we want to discuss when we talk about ethical storytelling. So something that we know will spark a lot of debate. That is something museums have to do. We have to, at least not be afraid to venture into these discussions, because it's part of our relevance. We have to make sure we incorporate multiple perspectives in this, and also to a certain degree the emotional impact, because sometimes when we talk about ethical issues or challenges, they are very emotional. I think especially when it comes to discussions around ownership, sometimes national ownership, I think that's a classic, but also sometimes personal ownership of objects or of narratives, or the ownership of a narrative, for example, by a minority group. These are issues and challenges that we really need to be aware of and be very, very considerate of. And balancing those narratives, I think, is vital when it comes to ethical storytelling. The next challenge, future challenge, I put on there is sustainability and environmental considerations. These become increasingly important, especially as institutions aim to minimize their ecological impact. And it will impact everything from exhibition materials, selecting sustainable materials in our exhibition construction and so on. It becomes vital. Energy consumption, we know that especially incorporating digital elements, lighting, interactive displays and so on, that consumes a lot of energy. To striking that balance. Also things like waste management. We do produce a lot of waste, especially when we produce exhibitions. and minimizing that, recycling what can be recycled and so on, becomes hugely important in this. The carbon footprints, transporting artifacts and materials from one place to another, when we do loans, for example, becomes hugely significant. Also things like the educational impact when we discuss this, and when we discuss immersive or engaging experiences, can be huge. The funding, of course, and the budgeting around this it becomes a huge thing when we discuss sustainability. And also the changing of technologies. Technologies evolve so quickly, and museums have to navigate the adaptation of new systems and equipment and so on. And there is also something said for navigating visitor behavior in this, and making sure that visitors are encouraged to behave in a way where we are reducing waste and things like conserving energy and things like that during their visits. And museums have a huge responsibility, I think, in securing this when we're talking about sustainability and environmental considerations. The next one I put up there is interdisciplinary approaches, and especially embracing these in museum interpretation and storytelling. This is what can enrich a visitor experience, especially when we incorporate insights from different fields. There are also challenges around this, around integrating diverse disciplines, and we certainly have to consider these as well in everything from our communication, collaboration dynamics. We all know that we work in different ways, but also to different paces and so on, and incorporating different disciplines in our expertise and in an open-minded way is hugely important. There's also complexities around like the depths we go into when we start to work sort of in an interdisciplinary way. How much detail do we go into, and how do we strike a balance between integrating specific concepts and keeping the content accessible at the same time. Of course, there are issues around expert availability. Can we find experts in the field we want to find? And how do we consider visitor engagement when we mix disciplines? How do we create a proper balance between the different disciplines? Making sure every voice gets heard is hugely important. How do we consider something like consistency in storytelling when we include and incorporate different academic or research or scientific disciplines in our storytelling and in our narratives? That's something that's very much worth considering as well, especially around interdisciplinary approaches. Long-term relevance is something I think we discuss a lot in museums, because ensuring a long-term relevance of museum interpretation is crucial for keeping exhibitions engaging and meaningful over time. But as we all know, there are several challenges related to long-term relevance that museums kind of have to address constantly. A few of those involve changing societal perspectives. So society changes all the time, politically, historically, religiously, financially, and so on. And that leads to a shift in thinking around historical events as well, and cultural narratives and how they are interpreted. So make sure that exhibitions reflect that changing viewpoint, and with of course still while respecting historical accuracy is challenging, but something we constantly have to consider. There's also the sustainability of the design we use, especially in so-called permanent exhibitions. So making sure that design trends may change or can be incorporated, not just physical layout, but also aesthetically, and striking that balance between
sort of a timeless design that can be changed and is flexible, and keeping updated with current trends. And then, of course, there is the entire aspect of new research and discoveries that come up from time to time, and making sure that we can incorporate that. That's the exciting part of updating interpretation and storytelling, that stories change all the time. New perspectives come in, new knowledge come in all the time, and it's something we have to consider in our design and narrative interpretation as well, how we incorporate new stories and new knowledge. There is the entire aspect of cultural sensitivity as well, around long-term relevance, and how we choose to incorporate that and work with that. The balancing of tradition and innovation can be really interesting to work with as well when we talk about long-term relevance. And of course, visitor expectations. Visitors may expect museums to offer new and updated content repeatedly whenever they come and visit. And this can be hard sometimes. Budgets don't allow for it always. But giving visitors something new and making them feel like this museum is still relevant to them can be hugely important. There's also a huge element around community involvement here, and making sure local communities and experts are involved in your research and your interpretation. That is very much a way of building trust as well, as we talked about, but also very much a way of staying relevant. I kind of put globalization and local identity up there under the same hat, because sometimes when we navigate sort of between presenting global perspectives and also honoring sort of unique cultural or historical context of a specific location, we can run into challenges as well, especially around how do we present a local narrative in relation to a global one. They might sometimes be similar, and sometimes they might be very different and complex, and you're dealing with perhaps a local situation, historical situation that may have been an exception rather than the norm. And this, of course, brings with it a completely different discussion around authenticity, balancing the desire to create a globally accessible narrative, and at the same time represent local storytelling and local history authentically. There's also the whole visitor expectation thing. Sometimes visitors expect to see something quite unique that may not actually form a global trend. And sometimes this can be used in interpretation and is quite an advantage, and sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge as well. When it comes to globalization, we also have to remember something like languages and translations, and providing information in various languages become a challenge here sometimes. There are also always nuances in interpretation. Different cultural contexts can lead to different interpretations of symbols, artifacts, historical events. There can be two opposite sides, for example, in a war, where you might be, let's say, biased in your interpretation because you might represent one nationality. There are some amazing examples of this in history. One that has always sort of stood out to me, perhaps because I'm Scandinavian, I'm Danish, and I've worked a lot in the UK. Is the story of the race to the South Pole, where the British Robert Falcon Scott and Norway's Roald Amundsen competed to get to the South Pole first, to the Antarctic first, in, I believe, am I remembering this correctly, 1911, I think it was. And the way these two men, these two explorers, are portrayed historically is very different in Scandinavian history and in British history. And I'm not saying one is more correct than the other, but Robert Falcon Scott is not always portrayed as being a hero or an active explorer in the best sense in Scandinavian history, because he effectively lost the race to the South Pole and also didn't really prepare as well as Norway's Roald Amundsen did. So the way they are portrayed in these two different national narratives is very, very different, where in the UK my impression is that Scott is very much kind of portrayed as a hero who died tragically in the search for the South Pole. That's very much not the case in Scandinavian history, where he was seen as a bit of someone who was very unprepared and didn't do particularly well in this challenge. But of course there are different narratives and variations of this story, and it's interesting to see sometimes how two different stories can develop around the same historical event, depending on national preferences. And again, I don't want to. I'm not telling you this story in an attempt to try and choose side, because if history and interpretation is teaching on us one thing, it is that it's always up for interpretation. It's always up for new ways of looking at the same stories and the same research and the same historical remains. But it's always been fascinating to me just how differently this story of the race to the South Pole especially has been portrayed in two different countries. And it's definitely something I think we need to be aware of as well when we are dealing with national history or national perspectives. The last one I want to focus on is adapting to changing learning styles. I think this is hugely significant for especially museum and heritage interpretation and storytelling, that we keep embracing different educational methods and that these preferences are evolving very, very quickly as well, not just in terms of digital learning or technological learning, but also in terms of things like multi-sensory engagement. Different learning styles vary all the time, and visitors prefer different way of engaging. We're also talking a lot about things like short attention span. In a world where information flows so quickly, it's worth paying attention to how our attention span develops as well as human beings, especially in younger generations. Something like diverse learning preferences, balancing different levels of engagement, how accessibility keeps changing as well. And also that balance between education and entertainment. How do we entertain as well as educate at the same time? And is it going to be sort of mixed in the future in a kind of edutainment kind of way? Or are we keeping it separate? What's the tradition or going to be in the future around this? And at the same time, respect traditions around learning styles, but also incorporating new learning styles, but at the same time respect that traditional ways of learning and storytelling can be complex, and some of these might be worth holding on to as well, even though we want to develop our storytelling and our interpretation as well.
I feel like a lot of these challenges might develop in very different directions in the future, and some of them might not even be challenges in a few years' time. But I think this is a subject that we need to keep discussing and keep alive, really, because the more we discuss these, the better prepared we are. And I think some of these we have a tendency of maybe not ignoring, but sort of overlooking a bit, and maybe not really consider that much. But the more we discuss potential challenges, I feel the better prepared we are, but also obviously without over discussing them, because then something that might not be a challenge risk becoming a challenge. So, it's a balance we need to keep. But they're interesting subjects to dive into from all perspectives of interpretation and storytelling. Now I would be really interested in hearing what you think and what sort of challenges or maybe potential risks or subjects, areas that we need to be aware of in the future of interpretation and storytelling. Please add your comments below.